Hi, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. With me is Sean Kay. Sean has been on Blogging Heads before. This is the first time I've had a chance to talk to him. How you doing this morning, Sean?
Very good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Sean is a professor of politics and international relations at Ohio Wesleyan University. There's a few things we wanted to cover today. Obviously, foreign policy being the main subject of this program, but specifically we wanted to start with what Senator Sanders, brought to the campaign on foreign policy. He's clearly someone who's focused throughout his career on issues other than foreign policy, to say the least. Domestic issues, economic inequality was a major thing that he brought to the primary debate, and I think it's very clear that he was successful in moving the debate in that direction, getting the party as a whole and Clinton in particular to pay closer attention and to take more of a progressive position on issues relating to economic inequality. His engagement on foreign policy issues came kind of late, and I think his impact was different and significantly smaller. But what's your perception of how this all worked, and why don't you talk a bit, Sean, of the role that you played as from an academic standpoint, working with the campaign or helping the campaign?
Yeah, thanks. So I was asked in, I think, February or so by the Sanders campaign, along with a colleague, if we would help coordinate a volunteer foreign policy advising apparatus, in effect, for the campaign. And I was actually probably going to sit this one out this time, but it was a really nice opportunity and an important moment of time. I think one of the first things that needed to happen was there a cohesive worldview that Bernie Sanders represented on foreign policy and national security? And I think if you looked consistently, his messaging was very tough. For example, on ISIS, but he did offer, I think, if you threaded together both the history of his speeches and his positions during the campaign, he did offer an alternative worldview, and I think it's important that it continue to be discussed, as we move towards the election and beyond it, which seemed to resonate. Even across parties to a degree, if you just focus on the issues. I would say his worldview primarily focused on a foreign policy guided by engagement and restraint. Engagement with adversaries, but restraint in terms of the use of force. And in particular, as he said often in the campaign, with regard to regime change. He brought he in particular brought the Palestinian issue very much to the forefront of discussion in foreign policy. And I think also he offered a broader sense that that America's power and role in the world stems both from its ability to be exceptional by setting the best example we can at home, and in particular through significant investments in the domestic foundations of power, human capital. And that's where I think even things like debt-free tuition and things like that was also a relevant part of a broader strategy. But it wasn't really a big topic in the campaign primaries. Foreign policy rarely is a major issue in primaries, even general elections too. But I do think he introduced some significant discussion on Libya, and in particular, as I said, the broader context of regime change as an approach to foreign policy.
Do you think it's fair to say, because I mean, some of the things you're saying that I noticed too, what he's, the kind of, we need to be strong at home to be strong abroad. We need to deal with our issues here. We need to rebuild our infrastructure, and we need to deal with these issues of economic equality, able to be able to engage abroad and advance our interests with our allies and partners in a way in the best way we can. I mean, there are clearly elements of Barack Obama's vision in that, and it seems to me, and I'm wondering if you agree, that Clinton and Sanders, in an interesting way, sort of took two sides of Obama's vision, because I think, even though people, have called Obama, clearly he's much more restrained than the previous administration of George W. Bush. I mean, let's recognize that Obama is projecting power all over the world in lots of ways, including very hard ways, with the use of drones. Obviously, we're still in Afghanistan. We're engaged militarily once again in Iraq and in Syria in smaller ways than we were before. But it seems that Clinton and Sanders, in some ways, they both took opposing poles of the kind of Obama vision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I think in one sense, it's natural since Secretary Clinton served in the first Obama term. But I do think it's. I think if you step back, many might disagree with this, but I think there was a lot of continuity actually between the second Bush administration and the first Obama administration. I mean, we surged into Afghanistan, we do the regime change in Libya, et cetera. Whereas it's the second Obama administration that starts to look more like the George H.W. Bush first administration, more guided by restraint and so forth. And the bigger picture is, I think, absent that ongoing policy discussion on foreign policy, and I think we've reached a point in the national campaign here where it's actually significant that we're really not getting a really good, robust discussion of, for example, what it would mean to put a no-fly zone into Syria or to arm rebels in eastern Ukraine.
Right.
And also because we're seeing a convergence of especially the neoconservative Republicans moving towards Hillary Clinton, we really don't know how that'll impact the Clinton administration down the road. But, I mean, it would be a reasonable thing to look at that and think, well, most likely it will be an administration that offers continuity over the policies of the last 20 years. The dilemma, I think, is that absent a really good, serious discussion of what worked and what didn't work during that period of time, we run the risk of making a whole new series of mistakes in the world. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
No, I think that's important. I mean, I wrote a piece for The Nation a few months ago that looked at Trump and looked at how, I mean, the basic argument I made is that Trump has succeeded, by essentially adopting the belligerent ultranationalism of the neocons, but dispensing with any of the kind of policy. He's basically just taken the bluster and left the policy aside. And one of the things that I talked to a few conservative analysts in there, including Chris Preble from the Cato Institute and David Gartenstein-Ross from Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and both of them made a really interesting and I think astute point, which is that the problem is, in foreign policy in general, but particularly on the Republican side, is that there has been a lack of a robust debate about, okay, what has worked and what has not worked. Can we, just to disentangle the ideology from the policy for a moment, a real debate about why Iraq failed, why the Iraq War failed in the way that it did. And, this is a few months ago. I think I published it earlier, it was earlier in the primary. And so there was still some hope that this debate might happen. I think clearly it hasn't, because Trump is just so nutty that there is very little substantive policy debate to speak of in general around his campaign. So that's something that, still really needs to happen, not only in the conservative movement, but I think more broadly. And I think the neocons moving, sidling closer to Clinton, some of them more openly than others. Robert Kagan doing fundraisers for her, Max Boot saying openly, I'm going to vote for her. Yeah, I think it's an open question of how this will impact or influence an actual Clinton policy.
Right.
It's clear that she leans in a more hawkish direction than Obama. I think it's unfair to call her a neocon, but she's clearly more in a kind of hawkish liberal internationalist vein.
Well, there's a lot of sort of high-end common goals of spreading democracy and power and so forth. But yeah, the means are very different between the neocons and the liberal interventionists. But they have dominated the policy circles of Washington for the last 20 years, and budgets follow that, and jobs follow that, and things get locked in place. So it becomes very hard to actually advocate for change. Doing an audit of the Pentagon, for example, that kind of thing. It's things get locked in, and I think that was one of the things that Bernie also really tapped into. Bernie Sanders did, which is this broader point too about the pervasive impact of money in politics, to include how it can affect our national security priorities. So, that's also a key point. It is interesting, by the way. A lot of the original neoconservatives were former Democrats who went to support Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. So it will be interesting for political scientists to watch and see if there's some kind of more durable realignment happening on foreign policy issues within political parties. But I would say, I give you an example of where I think, one of the dilemmas now is that because of Donald Trump and what I think are very legitimate concerns about his presidency, is that he's giving voice to that kind of nationalist angst that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it's kind of tricky, to critique the Clintons now, because you don't want to necessarily feed that in, to the Trump's advantage. But on the other hand, the nation needs a discussion of its foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also think that, a good example of that is there's three different kind of ways to look at something like the burden sharing issue. That was another priority of Bernie Sanders, and I think of this country too. I mean, it's been a priority in NATO since its founding, actually. It's not a new issue that Donald Trump tapped into there, but he has demagogued it very effectively to the point where he's doing damage. Like I gave an interview with the Washington Post where he sees like a bull in the china shop at a very bad time because you crack open something like NATO and you undermine, some of the core, very base elements of the international system since World War II. With nothing, and here's the key thing: with nothing ready to in place, so that seems to me like not well thought through. But on the other hand, the burden sharing issue is a real thing. So what Bernie Sanders, team was able to at least put together and articulate was an idea that instead of pushing European allies to actually spend a lot more money on defense, they should better pool their resources so they can work together in concert with the United States when our interests align. But that's the kind of policy debate we ought to be having. But instead, it's kind of boiled down to a charade in effect.
Yeah, I mean, Sanders was late, getting into this. I think you heard from a lot of people, including me and a number of my other progressive colleagues, that he needed to get engaged on this, and I'm glad that he did, because I think he did he did start a discussion on a number of issues, including, as you said, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And just disclosure here, I did share some ideas with the campaign, and I think he did take up some of these ideas that I and others were sharing with him, particularly with regard to Palestinian rights. It was very thrilling, I think, to see him say these things at the debate before the New York primary, because I think he's speaking for a large and growing constituency inside the Democratic Party with regard to U.S. policy on Israel and Palestine. And I would also say, I mean, this is something, that is, that continues from Obama as well. I think it's always been a mistake to treat the tensions between the U.S. and Israel over the past years as something personal to Obama and Netanyahu. I think both of these leaders are speaking for genuine constituencies inside their own countries, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to contend with into the future, regardless of who's president. But moving to the platform debate, I think, we kind of saw a reflection of Sanders' own emphases on what he was able to get into the platform and what he wasn't. He pressed hard on a number of issues. I was actually asked by the campaign to testify before the platform committee on the issue of Israel-Palestine. That was not among the issues that they gave any ground on. In general, I think they came out with a very, very good platform. It's a much more progressive platform than the Democratic Party has had in the past. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think they put a lot of effort into that. And I mean, it'll have to be judged against the weight of history of how well platforms have stood up post-elections.
In the hard light of reality.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it is a document that, in particular, more progressive thinkers can use to hold people's feet to the fire, in effect. I would say also, by the way, about Hillary Clinton and her general worldview, I think there are some qualifiers, even if her instincts are, maybe in alliance with some neoconservatives or liberal interventionists, however we want to frame it. There will be real constraints on a Clinton foreign policy administration. I mean, first of all, the world of today is not the world of 1994, let alone even 4 or 5 years ago. American power is in a different spot. There are other rising powers that constrain our ability to do certain things, and of course we're focused still on rebuilding our own economy, as is Europe and others. And also, I think even in pure political terms, she's going to be not wanting to risk alienating her base with wars of choice between now and say 2020. That said, one thing that concerns me about the broader point you're raising about, for example, the platform and the progressives, I will say this: I have not been aware of any outreach from the Clinton campaign to people who were working and advising for Bernie Sanders. And I think one of the brilliant strokes that Barack Obama had I did advising for that campaign as well back in 2007, 2008, was that as soon as he secured the nomination, they brought in all the Clinton foreign policy people. And my worry isn't about the personnel. My worry is about the policies. And the risk here is that if, the big question is, will the anti-Trump thing be enough to turn out these progressives, especially young people, to vote? And I saw during the campaign, maybe because I'm a professor, I work on with college students all the time, but a lot of dismissal, frankly, of young people's idealism. Like they're all for Bernie Sanders because they're hopelessly idealistic or something like that.
Right.
I thought that was quite frankly nonsense and patronizing, and because the young generation of today, if you think about it, what has their life been? It's been defined by reckless and disastrous wars. Right. It's been defined by both political parties ravaging the economy of this country with bad decisions. And they've been saddled with massive debt just for the crime of wanting to get an education, right? So that's not idealism. Those are harsh realities of life. Yeah. And if those things are not addressed in ways that people feel, not just hear, but feel, they may vote, but they may not vote enthusiastically and turn out and bring people to the polls. And that's important come November. So I hope that gets adjusted, personally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think, and again, that's something I think we saw consistent. I think the similarities between the Sanders movement, the Sanders phenomenon, and the Trump phenomenon were often overstated. Because it's cute to make these kinds of equivalences, and political journalists like to be cute.
So, some issues, by the way, that have shown common alignment, though, were on trade, for example. This just shows how if you get involved in these things, you don't always agree. I personally am a strong supporter, for example, of the TPP for strategic reasons, not for. The trade thing. I think Bernie's message on that was really important. That again, people need to feel the impact of these things in their lives. So rather than starting with corporations first, we should start with people first. And work up from there.
The point I was getting at is that what you do have that is genuinely similar is that you have a strong constituency on both sides, or let's just say across the board.
Yes.
Of people, particularly young people, who feel that the system is not working for them. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine, Chris Hayes, who wrote a really excellent book a few years ago called Twilight of the Elites, which
good book.
Very good book. Which looks at, the failure of these elite institutions and the lack of faith and trust that people increasingly have in these institutions. And I was joking that, we look at the 2007-2008 primary and it's almost like Twilight of the Elites, the movie. This is the expression of this diminishing trust. It's just this loud, statement that the system isn't working for us, whether it's our ability to engage, elsewhere in the world, the Iraq War, as you mentioned, just a disastrous use of American power, economic issues, debt, all of these things are pressing down on Americans, particularly young Americans. And they haven't seen, or at least in my perception, they haven't seen a message from the elites that they get it. And that is what Trump and Sanders both offered.
Yeah, it goes even deeper. Mentor, former boss and colleague of mine, Pat Cronin from CNAS, and I co-authored a piece at War on the Rocks about 3 weeks ago about the elite Main Street gap in America. And basically what we're saying is that Trump is a manifestation of a deeper problem, which is this disconnect that you're describing between people feeling that they're heard or represented or given voice in Washington. On the other hand, citizens have obligations and responsibilities too. Just sitting around and clicking on Facebook is not going to solve climate change, that kind of thing.
Right.
But that was one of the great things about Bernie Sanders' campaign, I think, was that it really was inspiring, not only in the sense for the young people, but also on they really did offer a model of how you can finance campaigns in ways that are responsive to the people that matter the most, which are the voters, as opposed to the other way around. It's a model one could hope that would be utilized in the future. I think that's really what he meant when he said political revolution, actually.
Right. No, and I think just speaking as because this is a foreign policy conversation, I think it seems to me that the right has done a much better job of kind of rooting their policy ideas and connecting their ideas about how American power should work into, you know, in a way that appeals to their base. Now, it's often an ugly and demagogic and inflammatory way, but I think on the left, progressives have to do a much better job of that. It may be the case that progressives are just simply less interested in foreign policy. Some people have claimed that. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think foreign policy in general is something that Americans across the board don't pay that close attention to, except when they feel it impacts them directly, as in the case of the Iraq War. But I think looking back at that and looking how the resistance to that war slowly arose among the grassroots and then was felt in the elites in Washington. And that, in my view, was how that happened. I think there are a lot of progressive foreign policy folks who feel like they were the ones who kind of brought this war to an end. And as I saw it, it was these elites finally paying attention to something that the grassroots were saying.
It's a really interesting challenge kind of going forward worldview-wise, because in many ways Bernie Sanders appealed both to realists and progressives.
Right.
And so maybe there's some merger there, which is around certain kinds of policy priorities. It's hard to see. But I also think, by the way, it should be said, I never thought I'd see a day in my lifetime where the Republican Party candidate for president would be openly embracing the leader of Russia. I mean, that's a major realignment, and what's fascinating about it is that there's no backlash against that, really, inside at least among the voting population. I mean, they're certainly maybe in Washington, but I don't think the voting population is listening to the people in Washington.
Yeah.
They're listening to the person in front of them, but again, I think realists certainly. Again, I think Trump is identifying more of a populism and a nationalism than a well thought through kind of worldview that merits a lot of serious consideration.
Right, I think that's right. Let's just talk for a minute how, we've still got a few months, 2 months now, September, more than that, before the election. I don't expect that the foreign policy debate will get all that much more substantive. Although I'm ready to be surprised. But what do we've seen this very interesting kind of, as we mentioned before, neocons starting to feel a bit homeless in the Republican Party. I had a conversation with a conservative friend of mine the other day who works in the Senate, and he was commenting on this, and this is very much a thing that's live inside the kind of neoconservative movement. They understand that this Republican Party is changing quickly, and it's going to be much, much less hospitable to them. And that's going to have serious implications, not only for their jobs, but also for the kind of their vision of American foreign policy. So, I mean, do you think it's right to imagine that we are seeing a major reorganization of how, the foreign policy circles and factions are arranged in Washington, or is it being overstated?
It's hard to say. We'll have to see. How that plays out. My guess is if neoconservatives feel they played a significant role in helping Hillary Clinton get elected, they're going to expect to have influence in a Hillary Clinton administration. I mean, that's politics.
Right.
I haven't heard her disavow the worldviews of neoconservatives in particular. I think that's actually, if they were listening, and I were to give one bit of advice to the Clinton campaign, it would be that I think one of the fundamental disconnects that I kept seeing as I was watching this, sort of quasi, informally involved at a volunteer level was that she was good at being direct about saying I'd made a mistake in her support for the invasion of Iraq, but people have heard that. There was a woman who asked her at a town hall meeting in New Hampshire. We looked at this very closely, or I did anyway, the question was not did you make a mistake, but rather what did you learn from the mistake that you made?
Right.
And I actually think it would go a long way if Hillary Clinton could just sit down and talk about how she learned and grew and evolved in terms of understanding foreign policy. I mean, what did you learn from Libya? because there's been no, I mean, so far it continues to be sort of put out there as if it was the greatest success of Clinton foreign policy. Libya is an absolute disaster and a fiasco. Everybody can look at that and know that. So why not find out what we learned from that so we don't make the same mistakes again? And I really think that would go a long, long way, and it's not a hard thing to do. Yeah, so
No, I think that's right, because I think a lot of progressives, myself included, have been concerned with, yes, she recognizes it was a mistake, but was it just a political mistake for her versus a strategic mistake for the United States? And understanding that she understands that it was the latter, I think, would go a long way, as you said.
I think it would. I think it would resonate a lot with people. And given that, the polls are tight, actually, tighter than they should be.
Yeah.
Yes, given what we've been looking at. So I hope they get that piece right.
And it's there's almost an interesting contradiction here in that, she's been clearly, I mean, if you look at the Democratic convention, it was clearly a tent widening exercise, which, listen, I'm in favor of. I mean, I think, Trump, the potential, the prospect of a Trump presidency is so frightening that I'm sort of like all hands on deck. Let's build as broad and big a coalition as we can. But the question is, okay, what kind of debts do you take on by bringing on some of these endorsees and by making some of these political promises and, building, kind of, I'm looking at the example of, General Allen, who by all accounts is a great, admirable general, very skilled, very smart. But, getting up there and saying we are going to, fight this crusade to end evil, I can see how that we might come to regret something like that in the future.
Well, not only, yeah, exactly, and not only that. I think as we look towards November, again, this is just an observation. I hard to quantify, but my guess is that high turnout clearly would favor Hillary Clinton. Low turnout, depressed turnout, could put that at risk. And so that's the key concern I would have. When young people and progressives hear that speech by General Allen, that was a pretty robust. I mean, that speech could have been given at the Mitt Romney convention, and as a call for exceptionalism. I mean, it was almost as if nothing had happened since the invasion of Iraq. And again, so it raises that question: is like people are outside looking at Washington, and it's not a Democrat Republican thing. It's like, have you actually learned anything from what's gone on in the last 20 years, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think rather than doing outreach, I mean, let's say, endorsees are good. You want more endorsees rather than less, but I'm sort of puzzled by this outreach to the neocons. I mean, because if Donald Trump has revealed anything, it's that the neocons have no real constituency.
Right.
What they have are a number of big donors who create think tanks and fellowships as these think tanks. They have no real grassroots constituency.
Yeah.
Donald Trump succeeded, was extraordinarily successful by dumping all of their policy positions. Now, what is a constituency? What is popular among actual voters is opposition to the war. I mean, this is, to the extent that there are any consensus foreign policy issues left in American policy, it's that the Iraq War was a bad idea. A majority of Republicans now recognize that the war was not worth fighting. So it does seem to me if the goal is to get more voters to vote for Clinton, that's something she could be a bit more explicit about.
Yeah. By the way, I'd like to ask you a question on the Arab-Israeli material. I mean, do you feel that yourself that those kind of introducing a more sort of broader scope view about how the Palestinians should be involved and respected and so forth, do you feel like that has legs going into a Clinton administration beyond the platform discussion?
I do feel it has legs. I think Clinton herself and the people who are advising Clinton have a particular view of how the U.S.-Israel relationship should be managed. And that the Palestinian issue and the issue of Palestinian rights is almost entirely subservient to that. I think that's wrong. I think that's a problem. I think it's outdated, just from a political standpoint. I think if Clinton, and I should say, I do think Clinton is genuinely progressive on a whole range of issues. But I think the stance she's taken on the Israel issue, which is to barely mention the Palestinians at all, while stressing how much she's going to hug Netanyahu, is problematic from a progressive standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think she's going. I mean, going back to what I said about Obama and Netanyahu and the reasons why it's wrong to kind of locate the source of their tension in their personal animus or unfriendliness or whatever. I mean, the fact of the matter is a majority, I think now, and a growing majority of Democrats and a majority of Americans. I think polls have shown for years that a majority of Americans support a more even-handed policy on the issue of Israel-Palestine. That's not to say they support hostility toward Israel or hostility toward Palestinians. They just support the idea that America should seek a kind of equal resolution and a just resolution for both of these peoples. So I think some of the things, the fact that this is a growing and increasingly vocal constituency in the Democratic Party is going to impact her approach to this. Even if she starts at a certain point, I think it'll draw it in another direction.
Well, and that's also, I mean, another constraint that's real and out there, which is that there were millions and millions and millions of people that did turn out and vote for Bernie Sanders. I mean, he got something like 45% of the Democrat vote. Which is astonishing. I mean, a year ago he was 3% in the polls.
Right.
So I think that's going to be out there and lingering, and it hopefully it'll carry on. And the thing I really hope is that let's put it. This isn't a criticism, but a lot of the people that early on in foreign policy advising sort of gravitated towards the Clinton campaign. That happened in 2007, 2008 too. It's very understandable. I mean, it's sort of. She was Secretary of State, Washington, and so on. But there was, without going into who, there was a very broad-ranging and sizable team of both realists and progressives that were part of the process of on Bernie Sanders. And I think in many ways, with time, they will also represent a new generation of outside the beltway and outside the box thinking on foreign policy issues. And I think that's something that wisdom in Washington will cultivate, because we need new thinking, we need new energy, and we need new ideas.
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, going back to what I was saying, about the Israel-Palestine issue is true of foreign policy more broadly. The question is, will these analysts, experts, and the folks on the grassroots side who are vocal about this stay vocal and stay engaged, and what organizations and institutions and tools will be created to continue to push for these ideas, either inside the Beltway or out, because that has been what is missing.
Or if they don't feel that change is really resonating with them, will they just throw up their hands and walk away?
Right.
And that would be really bad news for the country.
I agree completely. I mean, there is, in a sense, even though I think Sanders did bring something important to the policy debate, I think we often see on the left an engagement, a kind of ad hoc engagement when it's important. I mean, the Iraq War is going very badly. Let's all get engaged to end this war. If we could, I mean, the challenge is to create a sustained critique and a sustained, voice for some of these alternative foreign policy ideas. Now, I think what was done around the Iran agreement and the Iran diplomacy that led up to the agreement is a very good model, possibly broadened out. And just full disclosure here, I was a part of this kind of coalition of analysts and groups who were pushing for Iran diplomacy for years leading up to the agreement.
Which, by the way, I think Hillary Clinton deserves a lot of credit for in terms of helping rally the sanctions for. I think it's probably her most significant achievement, actually, as Secretary of State.
Oh, I actually agree. Not only the sanctions, but opening the back channel through Oman, which was instrumental in getting the agreement.
Right.
And I would also say this is something that she hasn't mentioned, and that's somewhat confusing to me, is that she, it was under her watch. Although UN Representative Susan Rice kind of brought it home, but she made it a priority to focus on the creation of a UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Iran, which was yet another tool for keeping the pressure on. Obviously, human rights, as progressives, we believe human rights is valuable in and of itself. But yeah, I agree that the Iran agreement should be listed among her accomplishments. She did very, very important work. But I do, and I should also say that her speech at Brookings, last year but she gave one of the best, probably in my view, the best defense of the Iran agreement and what it says about the effective use of American power. of anyone. Now, there were some hawkish elements of that speech that I will continue to keep an eye on, but I do think she gets, at a pretty deep level,
Oh yeah.
of why the Iran agreement was good, why it was an effective use of American power in this new era in which we live, and that's the sort of approach that I think progressives need to keep pushing for and asking for and encouraging if and when we see a Clinton administration.
The other big ticket item I think progressives could really contribute more thinking on is. And this would help the realists too. I think where I tend to personally kind of lean. I know these labels almost mean nothing anymore. Actually, I think, but the fact of the matter is, I think that bridging the so the key question is, how do you come up with a model, or is there one, to advance and spread human rights without the regime change element to it? Right. That's something I think inside the Sanders campaign we just never really had time or ability to flesh out. But I always thought that was, if we say we're opposed to regime change, rightly so, I think, given the record, but we still want to spread human rights, how are we going to do it? Right. And that, obviously one big answer, I think, was that we want to set the best example of values and respect as we can at home. And we're not doing very well on that front, right now. Yeah. So, but at least then others will want to emulate us and want to be with us. That's a long-standing thing in American foreign policy. Yeah. But in terms of outward reach, this question of pressure to, quote, do something to advance human rights. What does do something entail in Syria? Does it entail aligning with the Al Qaeda and ISIS groups, or does it entail aligning with Assad so it ends, or in the Russians, or does it entail occupying the country? I know it's much more complicated than that, but those are kind of the big options, and what do we want, And right. We also need to look around the world and take a hard look at some of our allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, right. Bahrain. There's all kinds of places where we could take a look and say, okay, yeah, Syria is horrible, and we have a big role in helping deal with the consequences of that. But what about the countries where we're actually patrons of, where we could maybe actually have some influence with regard to the advancement of human rights? So how we square that circle, I think, remains a big question going forward.
Agreed.
And that would help a new Clinton administration too, because maybe they were looking for other ways beyond the military tool, to reemphasize these kind of values, which are important to Americans.
So in the in the few minutes we have left here, I want to take some time to talk about your forthcoming book, which is something that really interested me. It's about, well, I'll let you explain it, but it is about rock and roll.
Yeah, this has been a fun project to work on. The book is called "Rockin' the Free World: How the Rock and Roll Revolution Changed America and the World." It's built around about 75 or so primary interviews I did in person or on phone or Skype with some major artists. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame members, Grammy winners, managers of groups like Bonnie Raitt, the Grateful Dead, REM, Nirvana. So get some really good behind-the-scenes insights. And the path that led me on was this basic premise that I interviewed Jan Wenner, the publisher of Rolling Stone, and he said when he was inducted to the Rock Hall of Fame that Bob Dylan gave voice to his vision of America. And so a lot of the book is about, well, what does that mean? What is this vision of America that broke through? And I'm basically arguing, and this is a general audience book, that the I'm not arguing causality. Like, I'm not going to say that hip hop, or as a tributary of rock and roll, was the causal thing of the Arab Spring or the end of the Cold War. But it amplifies. It helps with agenda setting, and so we've seen sort of rock and roll reinforcing fundamental, or even redefining fundamental American values that have rippled out into the world. So we're looking at values of freedom, equality, human rights, peace, and advance through activism and education. And I take that back in the book by taking the words of these artists I interviewed and asking them, well, what's next for both the rock and roll revolution and America? And I have a chapter on the recording industry and how that's actually posing some significant question marks in the regard to the future of whether these artists can continue to play the troubadour role that they have, whether it was Pete Seeger or David Crosby and Graham Nash or Serge Tankian today, who I also interviewed, along with people like Michael Franti and Billy Bragg, Dar Williams, George Clinton, and that kind of fun crowd.
And I think we spoke offline about, you did some interviews with the Plastic People from Czechoslovakia.
Well, no, I didn't interview them, but they certainly have a presence in the book. There's a chapter, a whole section on the Russian sort of underground rock and roll groups in the Soviet Union, and for that I interviewed Tom Shanker, who's now at the New York Times, who was the Chicago Tribune bureau chief there, and interviewed all these underground rock and rollers at the time in the Soviet Union. I also interviewed Liberty DeVito, who was the drummer for Billy Joel's band, and they played the first big rock concert in the Soviet Union in 1987. But way, of course, earlier in the early 70s, you had the Plastic People of the Universe in the Czech Republic, who were very influential on Václav Havel, and in fact their imprisonment was a big element of the Charter 77. And so I mean, in that case, you can say that there was like a real direct linkage between a rock and roll group and the spread of these values and beyond the Iron Curtain. And it's fascinating to look at, actually, that period of time. You have a run-up of so that happens in the 70s and kind of gets locked in. But then as the Cold War starts to unwind, you see Queen go to Hungary. You see Bob Dylan went to play in East Germany, and there's even a Stasi file on Bob Dylan that is public, or I guess you can get it. I got it off somewhere, or somebody wrote about it. And they say, well, he's kind of an old, tired person who's not going to affect anything. But then about a year later, Bruce Springsteen came to East Berlin and played a concert for 300,000 people, I believe the biggest concert since Woodstock. And what's fascinating, if you go online and look at it, the young people at that concert are all singing virtually every word to every song. They had to internalize the words and what this meant for them. So rock and roll and music overall can play that role of introspectiveness, but also connectivity that unites people and brings people together around common sentiments and feelings. This is more of a descriptive book built on the interviews than big, sort of heavy-duty political science, because I'm not trying to argue causality, but I also think it would be utterly ridiculous to ignore the broader impact of this really revolutionary music, and I don't define rock and roll specifically even as a musical genre, but more as an attitude and an ethic, and that has many tributaries to it as well.
Great. I look forward to reading it.
It's been a lot of fun to work on. I'll be eager to be done with it too. So.
And then when that's going to be published later this year, right?
December 15th. Yeah, it's available now on Amazon and other places. So.
All right.
I appreciate it.
All right. Well, Sean, really enjoyed it. Look forward to talking again soon.
Yeah, it's fun. Thank you. I appreciate everything you do. It's great work.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
All right. Cheers.